I'm Stephen West. I'm Associate Professor of History here at the Catholic University of America. I teach U.S. history, and I specialize in the history of Civil War and Reconstruction and their aftermath. So the importance of land ownership in American history has been vital from the early days of the Republic. So land ownership was for men, not women. It was for white people, not black people. Some of the greatest praise of the small landowning farmer came from no less than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson says land ownership is the material basis for the independence of white men. It gives them the ability to provide for themselves and their family without relying on anybody else, without having to take orders from anybody else, and thus it makes those white men the sort of ideal citizens for the new republic. Johnson is a thoroughly racist man. Johnson is also an advocate of a speedy Reconstruction. He wants to reorganize state governments in the former Confederate states on a whites-only basis. And so to do that, Johnson begins the process of issuing pardons to wealthy slave owners. This exact same kind of people who had brought secession about, people who owned huge plantations in the South Carolina Low Country. Those former slave owners, now pardoned by the president for their role in the rebellion, want their land back. And so they go to the Freedmen's Bureau, which is the agency in charge of matters relating to emancipated people in the South, and they demand the return of their land. And this begins a struggle between those landowners, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, Oliver Otis Howard, the namesake of Howard University here in Washington, D.C., and President Johnson over when and on what terms that land is going to be restored. Some freed people are able to hold on to their land for a number of years, but by late 1867, almost all of them have been required to give it back.
It provided 160-acre land grants to over 1 million white families for a small fee, but excluded the 4 million formerly enslaved people from the program.
So the history of 40 acres and a mule, as we think of it today, in many ways traces back to an order issued by U.S. General William Sherman in January of 1865. Sherman had just completed his march to the sea from Atlanta, Georgia to Savannah. Sherman was not a particular friend of African Americans. He was not a woke general in the terms of the 21st century. He had not particularly embraced emancipation as a war aim. He'd not embraced the enlistment of black soldiers during the war. He doesn't think black men should be enfranchised after the war. So he is in no sense a friend, particularly of African Americans. But he does one of the most revolutionary things to come out of the American Civil War. In January of 1865, he issues his Special Field Order 15, which sets aside land stretching from Charleston all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida, exclusive settlement of people of color, and he says they will be granted, as he calls it, possessory title to up to 40 acres of land. And so the notion of 40 acres and a mule traces its roots to Sherman's Special Field Order 15. Sherman didn't say anything about mules in his Special Field Order 15, but his army was marching fast through Georgia and then into South Carolina, and they were wearing out animals. And so when they would wear out a mule, they would leave him behind, often in the care of people just emancipated from slavery. Those people would nurse the mules back to health and then make them a part of their productive farms. So the mules themselves were not in Special Field Order 15, but they were part of sort of Sherman's march through first Georgia and then South. So that promise of land, the sort of the conjunction of timing here is striking. These treaties are being executed in early 1866 at exactly the same time when Andrew Johnson is fighting to see the Sherman Reserve quashed. Those freed people in coastal South Carolina kicked off their land. But he's treating the formerly enslaved people of the tribal nations completely differently. And the reason is sort of twofold. One is a question of whose land is at stake. In the case of coastal South Carolina, the land is owned by white former rebels, and Johnson wants them to have their land back. In the case of the tribal nations, the land that formerly enslaved people get will be land that formerly belonged to the tribal nation. The so-called 5 civilized tribes had held about 10,000 people in slavery, people of African descent, on the eve of the American Civil War. Those 10,000 people are emancipated in treaties that the United States government forces those Indian nations, those tribal nations. Some of those tribal nations had allied with the Confederacy, And the US government essentially uses that as an excuse to tear up its existing treaties. And in these new treaties, the tribal nations are required to do a number of things. They're required to emancipate the people they hold in slavery. They're supposed to extend them, if not citizenship, at least the privileges and rights of citizenship that members of the tribal nations hold, and they're supposed to give them land. Without land, African Americans understood that they were going to have to work for others. And what that meant, especially for African Americans in the wake of the destruction of slavery during the American Civil War, was that in most cases they were going to have to work for white people who had in many cases formerly enslaved those very same people.
White folks recognized pretty early on that one way to stop, to undercut it, was to get rid of land ownership.
While they celebrated the independence that land ownership brought white men, they saw it as the antithesis of the condition of enslaved black people, who were subject to a kind of absolute subjugation in their labor, their bodies, their family relations, were subject to the will of others. So in the mind of white Americans, land ownership and for white men and slavery for black people were always sort of bound up together.
Over the last century, America's black farmers have lost more than 90% of their land because of systemic discrimination and a cycle of debt.
This country is built on land that was stolen. You can't escape the history of it. The people who stole the land controlled the land use for all of these years. Through the controlling the land use, they controlled the wealth. That wealth is passed down intergenerationally.